Hello, and welcome to this episode of Hammering Down. I am so glad you are listening, and I am joined once again by one of y'all's favorites guests that I've had on. I've gotten so many DMs, so many things about him whenever I had him on, Mr. John Morrissey, the owner of the USL Tactics Twitter, which at this point I don't need to be shouting him out because he's gotten massive. But hey, if you're not following him on Twitter, you need to. How you doing, man?
Doing really well and excited to be talking about this matchup and for the season to be getting started.
I didn't even mention what we're doing. We're talking the Indy 11 and Legion match. This is our first official USL pre-match preview. Before we did one with Atlanta United, but that one's weird because it was a friendly. And did Atlanta United really care? Nah, probably not. But this is the real deal. This is starting the season. This is seeing who is probably going to be joining or maybe sitting just below Louisville City in the standings as they're going to be playing two matches and we're playing one. But let's see, start the season off right. So before we, I guess, just go down too far in the rabbit hole, what who's Indy 11 this year? They lost a lot of talent. What do you think we should be able to expect from Indy 11?
Yeah, I think the gains and losses are really the big thing you have to think about at this point. I mean, from the back with Evan Newton out the door, you had guys in the middle, Tyler Gibson, Drew Connor, Andrew Carlton leaving. And I wouldn't want to overlook the really big loss here, which is Tyler Pasher. So this is a completely different Indy 11 side in terms of a lot of the personnel. But tactically, I do think that they're going to be pursuing a pretty similar setup to what they were doing previously. So, yes, Pasher's gone, but you've brought in guys like Jordan Hamilton with MLS experience, Gordon Wild, who was really impressive in some of his USL run before. They brought in a number of central defenders and some interesting midfield talents as well. So, I think this is a team that'll continue in the sort of 3-5-2 system, but the people you're going to be seeing in it are very, very different.
The thing with Indy, and I've noticed this from a while back, is it always seems like they kind of play this like Tampa Bay Rays or Oakland Athletics, where they kind of moneyball, where they get a guy, build him up, they get really good and sell him, or they just go elsewhere, and they always seem to retool. Even though every year it's like, hey, they lost blank guy, they're not going to do it this year, but they always do. And the big name I'm hearing coming out of indie camp right now, aside from the new signing from today, which we'll talk about in a minute, is Nick Moon, who was a Lansing guy who he scored, I think it was like 6 goals when he was in League One. And then last year, where he, shortened year, but only scored 2 goals. But there seems to be a lot of hype around this guy. Is with your thing being statistics and seeing the analytics, is that something that's being backed up, or is it just like the eye test? Is the eye test what's telling everybody, hey, this guy can do it?
So he's almost a controversial subject when you talk to indie fans, just because the conversion rate for him was so low. This wasn't a guy who, as you mentioned, was scoring goals for Indy 11 last season. That said, I think every other part of his game really impressed me. And in terms of being a complement to what they were trying to do with Pasher, he couldn't have done much better. When he was with Lansing, he really took up more of a role on the right wing. He got a little bit of run at wing back, and he came into the indie camp last offseason and was converted to a full-time striker. And you saw him, he's got a very good frame. He's a big guy, and he almost had like a hold up type of game where you can lump it to him and Tyler Pasher can run amok all about that. And so I think if he can bring the finishing to the table this season, he could be a real weapon. But at the same time, he might struggle to get some playing time. I know they ran him out at the wingback spot in one of the friendlies, but that's crowded. This is a deep team. They've added a ton of forwards. If you think about Wild and Hamilton, but Manuel Arteaga, I mean, there's just a lot of competition for what this team is going to be this season. So I would love it if he had a breakout year, and I think he's got a lot of potential to do so. But at the same time, there's so much up in the air with how this team is going to look that I couldn't endorse it one way or another.
You know, through half the answer is, well, he was good, but he had Tyler Pasher on the team, or blank was good, but they had Tyler Pasher on the team. I mean, losing, it's kind of funny. You're losing, like you said, you lost Evan Newton, who by all accounts is one of the best goalkeepers in the USL. Dude was fantastic. I think he was a two-time, maybe just one-time Golden Glove winner. With I know one with was a stacked FC Cincinnati side who maybe that year say, oh, the defense held it up for him, but then he kept doing it at Indy 11, just
Right.
fantastic. And you would think that'd be the story of the year that Indy lost their guy to MLS. No, it's Tyler. Tyler Pasher goes to MLS. He's starting. I think he started 2 matches for Houston, and he's
Two
not
games, two
starting.
assists. Yeah.
Yeah, he's not just starting; he's thriving. And Indy lost that. Who's going to kind of take up that spot for Indy, you think?
So in terms of the system last season, you really saw that 3-5-2 with Pasher up top, and he'd run into the channels. He'd be the guy that you really funneled these long balls into. And there was almost a reliance on that to a detriment for the Indy 11 team, especially as it got down to the end of the season and that strategy began to be a little bit transparent. So some of the guys who've come in really give you a different kind of option in terms of what you're trying to do. There's still going to be the big reliance on the fullbacks in AOZ and Carl Haworth, who generate a ton of offense. I did a post on the USL Tactics show about AOZ. In the midfield, Nicky Law, who was brought over from England, who has experience at the highest level of the Scottish game with Rangers, seems to be a creative presence. But Jordan Hamilton has been the one who's really putting up numbers in the preseason. He's a product of the Toronto FC system, a really good forward. He's not been the most productive in MLS, but he's really got a complete skill set. He's a really deadly finisher. So I think Indy, who was a very long ball centric team last season, could look to play a more possessive style. You could see a more of a double pivot with two defensive midfielders, which would allow the fullbacks to provide a little bit more width up the pitch. But if I'm making predictions, then it's a little bit dishonest because I don't have a clue how this team is going to look.
That seems to be a lot of indie fans. There's a lot of fans in the USL who are going off of merit alone, which, hey, Indy has deserved to get the merit of, yeah, they lost all these players and they look like they're going to suck or at least not be as good as normal, but it's Indy. They're going to do something. And you have other fans that are like, they can't rebuild. Like they've lost way too much. And even when they brought in kind of replacement, they played kind of different games, but they brought in Cal Jennings from Memphis 901, who Legion fans probably just got PTSD from hearing that name, and they probably just logged off this podcast after hearing the name Cal Jennings. But you got him. You had him for like a month, and then he's going off to LAFC, which, by the way, he just got an appearance. So it's not like he's just some bench rider. He's getting playing time. So you're like I said, Indy 11 just gets talent, they lose talent, and yeah, Hamilton's getting a lot of the spotlight through this preseason, but I guess the question is can he do it whenever it really starts? Because while Indy has played some real deal talent, I think they played Pittsburgh, correct?
Yeah, just the other day.
And but nothing really came of that. There's nobody really talking like, oh, this team's legit. It just seems like another. It's Pittsburgh. We just managed to have a 1-0 or 0-0 draw because that's what Pittsburgh does. They just tie everybody. So it seems like through this entire preseason, we've learned absolutely nothing about Indy, which leaves them to be one of the most confusing teams for me.
There's been so much turnover even within these preseason lineups that I'm having an impossible time trying to figure out how things are going to go for this side. And especially for me, the big puzzle is what's happening with that three at the back system. They brought in Jared Timmer, who, for my money, was one of the best center backs in the league with Reno. They brought in AJ Cochran, who's got a huge track record with Phoenix and at other stops. There was, I believe, an Eastern European center back brought in, a younger one, Aiden Liu. There's so much depth at that spot, especially when you consider that Hackshaw and Wimet are back as well. And the lineups have been different every single time in that regard. So you don't even know what base this team is building off of at a certain point, and it'll just be interesting to see how things shake out.
So you mentioned a name there, and for maybe some of the guys who are listening to this podcast, they're maybe a little bit newer to USL because we've only been around for 3 years. But if you're a USL veteran, the name Hacksaw, not only is it the coolest name in USL, but also that name, everybody knows it because he's the real deal. Why should Legion fans be afraid of Hacksaw and not just because of his name? Because I mean, I am terrified. Every time I've seen him in a lineup, I'm like, freaking great. We're screwed.
I think the versatility is one thing for him. I do want to point out that he might have the best name, but he also has the best hair rocking that afro.
Yes. Yeah.
But so yeah, he was with the Charleston Battery for a while, and he played largely as a defensive midfielder, as a left back, and he could slide over to center back. And in this Indy system, he sort of holds down the left flank and really lets Ayoze get forward and be a threat down the wing. But he's an excellent passer. I mean, for my money, maybe the best offensive center back in terms of facilitating possession, sparking play. But he's really got a great positional sense, and it's something that's earned him tons of appearances for the Trinidad national team. He's a perennial contender for those all league spots as a central defender, but he has that flexibility where he can just maraud forward and almost be like a box to box center back. If we have any English soccer fans listening, you'd almost be reminded of Sheffield United with the whole idea of the overlapping center backs. That's the exact role that Nabil Hackshaw fills, and he fills it really, really well.
I decided to pull up the roster on my phone just so I can make sure I knew what was going on. And as you're talking about him, I'm just looking at this afro for Hackshaw, and it's so good. I mean, I love if we're talking just best hair game, I am going to be partial to Jaden Cervania because he has one of the most flowing afros I've ever seen. Like most afros, whenever even when they're playing, they kind of stand up. Or if you have like guys with long hair, it flows. But his is just a long flowing fro, and it's majestic in pictures, but there's not a single afro better in the USL. There's no way. And you lost, well, you guys have played against, and this is just still hair talk. This is for another team, but I watched them the other day. Corbin Bone for Lou City constantly goes from best hair to worst hair day in, day out in the
That
USL.
is right.
He goes from just looking real nice, and you're like, man, a man with good hair, and then suddenly he shaves it off and it's just a rat tail. Like, what are you doing, man? Like, you have nice hair. Stop.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a dyed phase, there's been the rat tail. You'd think he would just settle on something that looks good, but evidently not.
Well, I don't really have a good segue for hair, so I'm just going to move on. But so the big question for me, besides who's going to be scoring, is who's going to be keeping the ball out of the net, because a lot of people, it was pretty assumed that Jordan Farr was going to be the guy. But then Indy brings in the 6'6" behemoth himself, Bobby Edwards, and it seems like he's getting a lot of the starts. Is this let's get him used to the system because Jordan knows it, or has Bobby just taken over that number one spot?
I can't get a read on things really there, but I'm working under the presumption that Farr has to be the starter. He has been a servant to this club for years on end, backing up Evan Newton really excellently. There was a stretch 2 seasons ago when Newton went out for a couple of games, and Farr came in and was excellent in granted a limited small sample size, but he put up better numbers than Farr did, or rather put up better numbers than Newton did in terms of goals saved above average. I mean, he distributed really well. Any Indy fan could tell you that he's more than able of serving as a starting keeper in this league. I almost expected him to leave before Newton ended up going to MLS. But yeah, having Edwards in there is just an interesting move because you've got this conundrum again where you've got two goalies who, for my money, are in the fringe of the top 10 goalies in USL, possibly. So, long story short, goalkeeper is another position where I don't really know how things are going to shake out, but I guess it's a good problem to have at this point.
I mean, you got to feel for Jordan Farr, which I mean, a lot of fans seem to love him. Not only did he has he been a servant to the club, he's done nothing but shown good things on the pitch, but off the pitch, like he did their USL E Cup thing. He's so
Yeah,
involved on Twitter and on social media.
nicest guy.
Nicest guy. And it seems like Indy 11 are just like, oh, is we have this guy named Jordan Farr, we can play him, or we found out that FC Cincinnati just dropped their goalkeeper. Let's just get another one of theirs because it was Evan Newton first, and Jordan Farr's like, okay, I'll stick around. He'll leave one day, and he leaves,
Right.
and then they're like, and Indy's like, oh, there's the backup for Cincinnati. We haven't had one of those in a little while. Let's get him in. And now that has to be hard. That has to be really hard on a guy, especially who's been so loyal to a club for Jordan.
Yeah, I can't even imagine. And granted, he's handled it like an absolute veteran despite his relative young age in his mid 20s for a couple of years now. But you have to think he thought this was going to be his chance this year if Newton left. And I don't know. I'm hoping that he'll be the starter just because I've got that attachment to him, and I don't love the Cincinnati connection just out of a bad memories sense, but we'll see what gives.
So there's there is a new guy, and there's just like always, there's a lot of unknown with Indy this year, and the newest unknown is their brand new signing, Mr. Vassell, who is it seems like he is a free kick specialist. He is just a clinical finisher, which may be assuring some stuff up in the scoring department. I know it's kind of early and you may not have a lot of time and together a lot of stats, but this is another MLS guy who has real deal experience. What do you think this means for the Indy team? And is this going to be a guy that can make an impact day one, possibly against the Birmingham Legion?
So I would be surprised to see him get game time in the first match. He seems to fit in more of that maybe attacking midfield role. He can play a box to box role if he needs to do it. And Nicky Law has held that down pretty consistently in the preseason. In fact, I think Law is one of the most likely players to really hold down a starting 11 spot confidently for the season. He could slide in the midfield depending on what kind of shape this team wants to pursue and how aggressively they want to look versus playing two defensive midfielders. But he seems to be very high potential for this side. He's made, I think, 17, 18 appearances for the Jamaican national team, which is nothing to scoff at. And he's typically played in that attacking midfield role for them. So I'm hoping that as the season wears on, he finds his place into the starting 11. But as you sort of hinted at, I don't really have a ton of a sense about his game at this point in time. But on track record alone, I'm excited about the signing.
I just want to use the Vassal signing as a way for me. Sorry, you're about to get into a middle of a rant that I have, but
Love it.
I I am so mad that a team like a country like Jamaica, who has talent all over the world, like they're starting to really push into the English Championship and places like that. But when they rolled out their team against the US, a guy who is one of the best finishers in all the USL, and Nico Brett is just not playing up top for them. But they have, I'm pretty sure they rolled a guy out there who was a striker for them, who was just a really good Jamaican league player, but the Jamaican leagues are significantly lower than the USL. And the
No
fact that you
doubt.
have a clinical guy like Nico Brett out here who could really make a difference on that Jamaican national squad, the fact that he's not playing for them just does not make any sense to me. But
No, I mean, I'm thinking about it was Brian Brown he's with New Mexico now, but and this was back in the NASL days, in fact, where he was with maybe like Portmore or Harborview in the Jamaican League, and he put up absolutely gaudy numbers, like tearing the league apart. He makes the move to the NASL and hardly scores a goal for Indy 11. There's a real leap in quality between what you face in Jamaica and what you're getting in the American lower tiers, even. So, like, I mean, I think Nico Brett could absolutely pull it off for the national team, but I don't know.
Yeah. Well, speaking of another Jamaican guy, which he comes with a whole slew of controversy, and that is Junior Flemings. If that you're an Indy 11 fan listening to this, or if you're a Lou City fan, for your two matches, you're not going to see Nico. He is, or not Nico. Ooh, you will see Nico. I hope. You won't be seeing Junior because he is still serving 2 games of his suspension. Um, there's a whole lot to say about that, but that this is not the time to do that. I think it should have been longer, but that's just me. Um, I digress. You're not going to be seeing him. So these lineups that we've been seeing for the Legion are not going to be what we're going to see put out there. Um, Recently against the Chattanooga Red Wolves, Nico was left out of the starting 11. In place, Jaden Cervania was plugged in, which, just a Puerto Rican national, not a big deal. Um, he was just plugged in for Nico's spot or out onto that right wing. So I'm assuming maybe that could be where we see Junior's replacement be is someone like a Jaden Cervania. Um, how does that with a basically a 4-3-3 and 3 very good attackers in Nico and JJ and Jaden, what kind of pressure would that put on a back line for Indy?
So at the end of last season, Indy, in my assessment, ran into two problems as they sort of collapsed down the stretch. First of all, was the teams clamping down on Tyler Pasher. And second was this slate of teams who played in a 4-3-3 or played with 3 forwards at least that completely threw the back line into a tizzy. So if you think about like St. Louis with Rivas, Cicerone, and Tyler Blackwood, Louisville would push Ownby and Hopino up top with Cameron Lancaster, and you would match that man for man against the 3 at the back line. And when you've got someone like a Nabil Hackshaw who is going to be pushing forward, when you get the same thing out of Carl Womet on the right side, suddenly there's a turnover and you've got 3 forwards against 2 center backs. That's trouble. And so I really don't love this matchup for Indy 11. And I think that Junior Fleming's missing out is a big deal. Brett is a threat. I mean, JJ Williams could be a threat. I do think Serenia's a little bit raw at times, and especially
Yes.
when you're comparing him to someone like a Junior Flemings, who, for my money, is one of the best wingers in the league, who is a constant goal threat and whose dribbling would really challenge whoever Indy ends up starting. That said, I think the matchup is a favorable one in that sense for Birmingham. I think it's hopefully Martin Rennie has learned some things from what went wrong at the end of the year. But that front 3 with Bruno Lapa lurking behind them is something to be afraid of.
I mean, I think a lot of people in the USL that haven't really picked up on the offensive presence that Legion have because it just kind of silently happened. I didn't even realize. I realized that we were signing some offensive threats, but after I looked at this roster, I was like, that's terrifying. That because it even flew under the radar for me, and I follow this club religiously. Um, and it's kind of interesting to see how that happened just kind of overnight. So I'm very excited to see how it all comes together and if it will, because we've seen with live streams on Legion TV or Legion FC TV, um, one against Atlanta United and one against the Chattanooga Red Wolves. Um, and with the Atlanta United match finished 0-0, the one against Red Wolves finished 4-1 in our favor. But I felt much less confident after the Chattanooga Red Wolves game because I thought it was the worst 4-1 win of all time. Um, and the reason is because against Atlanta United, our front three pressed the mess out of them. It was like watching a prom baby Bulls team where they would just press the mess out of whoever had the ball. It was just constant running, constant. We're just going to press them and get the ball back and force mistakes. But then against Chattanooga, we just kind of let them have the ball and we try to counterattack on mistakes, which is fine. We have the speed to do that as a team, but it I just don't think we should have to, because last year teams figured out that we're going to counterattack and they just let us have the ball and we couldn't do anything with it. So I kind of have a two front question for you. The first one is, if Legion are the pressing team and they're going to be trying to force mistakes out of that back line, is that going to be one of those, because you have a center back that can push up and go for them? If we had that pressing team, is that going to be more detrimental to Legion, or is it going to be one of those things where a 3-man front can really bog down that 3-man back line, or which plan of attack would probably be better against Indy?
I think there's a route to success no matter which game plan you go with, but I would almost lean towards that sitting back, counterattacking strategy, just because I think you put the onus on Indy to really create with a group that doesn't have much chemistry. And given then, say you're Birmingham, Indy plays a sloppy pass because Nicky Law doesn't know where Gordon Wild's going to be. They don't know each other's tendencies. You dump the ball to Bruno Lapa, and suddenly you've got a counterattack going. You let Ryan James carry the ball up the pitch, transitioning from defense into the offense, and you've got a breakaway with 3 forwards bearing down on center backs who may be out of position. At the same time, I definitely think you're right that there is a possible problem if there's too much passivity. You can't invite pressure for 90 minutes and not give up a goal. And that's true at the USL level. It's true at the Champions League level. It's just a fact of the game that if you let the other team dictate the tempo too much, it's going to lead you to trouble. So I think they have to strike a proper balance where maybe the counterattack is the first thing you lean towards. But if you get the ball, you keep the ball and see what gives with it, because this is a really talented side with a great midfield, competent defenders, and I think they can cause Indy some trouble if they want to go out and dictate the game some.
So all that to say, I feel, I want to say I'm confident, but again, it's Indy 11. Like they always just seem to do it. If they were to do it, they go out and let's say they beat Legion 2-0. What is Indy's plan of attack and how will they do that?
Right. Well, first and foremost, I think the center backs have to play a disciplined game. And I think that you maybe see AJ Cochran slide into the middle of the center back trio in that case, because I think he gives you that level of veteran leadership, that level of adaptability where he doesn't necessarily need to be bled in over the course of a long campaign. I think that the wing backs get involved and really cause trouble for Williams and Savannah out wide, where they're not able to challenge the center backs in the same way because they're so focused on those defensive responsibilities. And I think you clamp down on Bruno Lapa to the greatest extent that you possibly can. And that's why I'm sort of leaning towards that setup with 2 more defensive-minded midfielders, which would be Gershon Kofi and Sissoko, who they brought over from the Canadian Premier League. At the same time, I still think that Martin Rennie might have something a little bit different up his sleeve. And there's nothing that's given me that indication. But for him to run out the same 3 at the back system, playing long balls, getting beat tragically kind of game for another campaign would really be a poor choice, just given the fan tiredness and fatigue with some of the performances that we've got. There was a real Rennie out movement after last season's collapse. And I think he would lose a lot of the goodwill that's come with the roster reconstruction if he comes with a similar setup to what's happened. So I think just showing some of that incremental change, and being aware of the threats that Birmingham provides. And not only that, but leveraging those threats into something that you can use yourself to punish them would be positive.
I'm going to kind of put you on the spot. If you don't have an answer, it's fine. But let's just assume that you've taken over for Indy and you're playing this one match and your players are comfortable with the system and they all know each other. There's no problems. Oh, I just hit the mess out of my mic. That's going to sound horrible later. Um, there's no problems. Everybody's comfortable with each other. What lineup would you be putting out there and what formation? I mean, maybe not specific players, but like what would you personally do to try to break down this Legion team?
That's a very good question. I think just given Indy's personnel, I'm gonna stick with the 3-5-2 so far in goal because of the innate bias I have towards him. At those wingback spots, I think I have to go with Aozi on the left and Carl Haworth on the right. Haworth, by the way, deserves more praise all around. He's been fantastic from Ottawa onwards for years, and I think he gives you such a strong offensive threat from that spot. Hackshaw has to be in there for me, and putting Cochrane in the middle of the center defense. And Carl Womet can probably slide into the right, though I wouldn't be surprised to see a Jared Timmer come in or a Malich. The question for me is that center midfield. Nicky Law is a player with a lot of progressive passing in him, but I think his legs are a little bit slow if you need somebody who's going to be putting the pressure on Birmingham. That said, I think I would throw him into the lineup. Gershon Kofi is someone with a really strong MLS background who, hey, why not put him in as the DM? And if under that assumption that you gave me that everyone is comfortable, I think I'm going with Peter Lee Vassell in the middle because I think he gives you some of that box to box equity, but really can give you a more offensive threat. And maybe he slides in ahead of Law, even in terms of the attacking approach that you get from a midfielder. So I think you've got a well balanced midfield three there who's capable of not only providing a threat going forward, but maybe tracking what Bruno Lapa's doing, winning the ball some, really just giving you everything you could want in the midfield. Up top, going with Jordan Hamilton and Gordon Wild, who I keep referencing. I think Hamilton, as a striker, is someone who's constantly probing the back line. He'll put pressure on your Cavitas, your Canales, and really make them aware of the fact that he is on the pitch, being physical, testing them at every moment. Wild is a bit more of a finesse player. He's got experience as a winger. He'll drift around almost in a more passer like role, but a little bit more tame, a little bit more within the constraints of a system where he's not dominant. So I think overall, it gives you an attack that can easily become almost a front four when those fullbacks bomb forward, but you have a lot more forward impetus and creativity in the midfield, albeit with that anchor and Gershon Kofi, who can allow those fullbacks to bomb forward, who can step back into that back line and let Nabil Hackshaw go hog wild. Would that beat this Birmingham side? I hope so. And I think it would be really bad for Indy if they went out and got smoked throwing out that kind of lineup. But at the same time, I don't know. I think that would be a very competitive side.
I- It's just one of those things. Like, there's just some constants, it seems, with the USL. I mean, Lou City always has just big USL named talent. Like, it just
Mhm.
always seems like I have somebody on their team, or this year, multiple somebodies. It's just like, oh, yeah, they played this many games in MLS. They have this much USL experience, and they're beast. They shouldn't even be at the USL. They should be at a level higher. Just stupid things like that. And Indy Eleven's one of those teams that you're kind of listing off names and you're like, oh, I've heard that guy once, or if that guy's really good. But the rest, it's like,
Yeah.
who is this team? Who is this guy? And they always seem to do it. So I feel like this year is just a bigger question mark than ever, it seems, at least from the Indy fans.
There's just been so few names coming back compared to a normal campaign. And I mean, just from being a soccer nerd, I know a decent amount of the guys who have come in. And I've not even mentioned players like Reese Buckmaster, who's another USL stalwart. You would know him from Memphis last season, I think.
Mhm.
But it's going to be really interesting to see. The track records that some of these players have are really great. It's just a matter of getting a system that integrates all that talent, keeps people happy, and does this in a way that makes sense and really dictates a style. And you question the ability for that to happen almost. But I mean, at the same time, you can't help but be hopeful at the beginning of any campaign. And I'm taking off the USL Tactics hat and putting on the Indy fan hat. I think this is a solid playoff team, and I hope that's the case.
In my lineups or in my preview, I had Indy finishing third. And this whole
Same.
year, I've just been sitting there and I'm like, this team isn't that good. This team isn't that good. Then I looked at the schedule and I just kept putting, they'll probably win here. And, the way I do mine, I have the schedules all written out. And, there's only so many wins I can go around. And,
Mhm.
and sometimes a team like, let's just say, for example, Indy goes to another team and usually they're like, they wouldn't beat this team away, but the other team is going through, five matches in the span of, a week and a half, you know, legs get tired. And Indy has one of the easiest schedules of the year. And they always just seem to do it. and and they have just enough talent where I'm like, they can beat all these bottom four teams of the Central Division easily. So
Right.
I think the mindset for Indy, maybe I'm speaking out of turn here. You can speak more as an Indy fan, is win, get in, and let's just see what happens.
No, I think that's definitely the case. And you raised that really good point. And I haven't got around to the Central Division pod that you put out yet, but I'm excited to be listening to it. Um, I think the bottom four in this division is incredibly weak, especially after that OKC performance the other day, where
Yeah.
they're, I'll have a post out in the next day or so on this, but that was a tough defensive performance for them. I was hopeful that they would pull it together, but oof.
I'm not going to ask you to spoil anything, but in my Central Division breakdown, when I got to the OKC part, I said it, and this might be slight overreaction, probably was, but that is OKC might have one of the worst USL defenses I've ever seen. And that sounds horrible, but I cannot think of many worse defenses I've seen through all my years of watching.
You look at what that team did last year, where you couldn't go a single game without some horrendous miscommunication. And then they bring in Connor Donovan, who's an absolute vet. They bring in Mitchell Osmond from the Indy 11, who never got a ton of playing time, but was solid. And then it's the exact same thing over and
Yeah.
over again, where there's constant miscommunication. Like, I would be dying if I was an OKC fan right now, especially given some of that attacking talent they brought in.
Yeah,
They should be better than this. But hey, I mean, due for the misery, I guess.
I guess so. Well, there's really not a lot more to cover. You did, as per usual, an amazing job just breaking things down. And, if you haven't followed John on social media at USL Tactics, you absolutely need to. It's must need. I have all of his threads turned on. I read every single one of them. Most of them, I don't. I understand because he does a great job at breaking it down, but I'm just so thankful that he puts it into a just an easy to understand system, because half those numbers I'm like, I don't know what that means, but he says it's good. So that means it's good. So you're definitely a must follow, and I definitely recommend everybody to go follow you, man. So
Really appreciate that. Yeah, I
just
mean, hey, ditto for you. I like no better coverage of what Birmingham is doing. I mean, love the podcast. So keep doing what you're doing too, by the way.
appreciate it. I do. I just so people, whenever they go follow you, whatever you're doing for either USL, the USL show, or just your own content. You mentioned the OKC stuff, but is there anything that you have your particular eye on coming up for this week, whether releasing content or just a matchup you're ready to watch?
Yeah, in terms of content, there will be the USL Tactics show where I'm going to be talking a bit about the Louisville City defensive approach and specifically the pressure they put on against Atlanta United. Beyond that, I'll have a little bit of preview content for some of the games this weekend. Really excited for that Phoenix San Diego matchup. Really excited to see how Colorado Springs looks in their sort of new look debut against San Antonio. And then I've not been covering Miami much, but if you think about some of the guys they brought in, really excited to get to watch them play. And I think they're gonna absolutely demolish Loudon. So that will be a fun game to see.
Yeah, that Miami team, it's everybody saw the people that were signing, but people have forgotten just who they have on that team. And I'm so glad they're not in our division because they would definitely screw some people out of some playoff spots.
And I thought that last season, but this feels like a more, I don't know, intentional roster build, maybe would be the term for it, where they've got that solid midfield with three just brick walls. Like Speedy Williams, Akinyoti, Roseboom, like what a trio. Billy Forbes and Francois. I mean, I could go on, but they are going to be good.
Well, I cannot thank you enough for hopping on. Again, I could rave about your content for hours. I read it every single day, and it's a must read. If you're not following John, you need to like stop listening to this episode. Go follow him right now. It's a must read, must watch. Thank you, man, for coming on.
Yeah, thank you for having me and come on, you boys in blue.
See you, man.